Welcome, everyone. And Sue, over to you.
Myth number 7, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And I picked that picture because I think it says it all in one picture. Um, so, so the components of the myth is that Israel is a benign democratic state seeking peace with its neighbours. And if anything went wrong, it was in 1967, which turned an honest and hard-working society into an occupying power. And I think like part of that sentence, Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East, the words "only" and "Middle East" do a lot of work, because I think it's that latent kind of racism around, the neighbours that Israel has, and the Palestinians being kind of less than human, less civilized, and less worthy. So there's this sense that Israel is kind of forced into this position of being an occupying power, and it only occupies as long as the Palestinians are not ready for peace. And then that leads to the lie that Israel is only acting in the interest of its own security, which we keep hearing about now in Gaza. But interestingly now, I mean, from last week's chapter about the 1967 war not being a war of choice, now, after the ICJ ruling on Israel being an apartheid state and illegal occupation, Netanyahu has just given the game away by saying, we have every right to be in Judea and Samaria. It's our land, and we own it. So the plan was always to annex the West Bank. Okay, so Pappé talks about how pre-1967 Israel still couldn't be viewed as a democracy because a fifth of the citizens were subject to military law. There was a denial of basic human and civil rights. Governors and military officials had absolute powers, and they could just devise arbitrary laws for Palestinians. They can destroy homes and livelihoods, incarceration without trial. And the Palestinians were pushed into smaller and smaller enclaves, into ghettos from 1948. And you had complete expulsions of towns. And one thing I always find strange is the kibbutz movement, which is seen as this kind of social utopia, but yet they took over, these beautiful Palestinian villages for themselves. And then you had the military state terror in the form of massacres. So in 1956, there was the massacre of Qasim, when 49 Palestinians were killed for apparently on the pretense of breaking a curfew. But I mean, even that in a democracy, why is there a curfew, and why would you be killed for coming home late? So I think it's really important to recognize that right from the beginning, Israel has never operated on democratic principles, and it forces us to confront its origin story. So all these ingredients, military law, forced expulsions, incarceration, they're all part of Israel's foundation story. And you can draw a straight line from this point all the way to where we are today. Right, okay, so post-1967, once Israel had the territorial gains, laws were passed to ensure a superior position for the Jewish majority. And this is most importantly encompassed in the law of return for international law of return for Jews. So Jewish people anywhere in the world have the right to immigrate to Israel, while Palestinians who have lived for generations in the land are not allowed. And that Palestinian right of return is an internationally recognised UN General Assembly resolution. So right from the beginning of its formation, Israel hasn't complied with this. And I think the right to return should be at the heart of any resolution. There can't be any reconciliation without it. You can't have a dispossession of an entire people that leaves them at the whims of Israel. So I think in the Oslo Accords, this right was abandoned, was given up, and the PA, which is Israel's policing arm in the West Bank, and tellingly Israel's preferred puppet government for a future Gaza, they also give up this right of return. And I just think it's really important that we make that a central part of any peace, plan for peace. Okay, right. Okay, so Pape talks about how militarized the state is, and so why is Israel such a militarized state? And obviously, it's because it's founded on this displacement of the Palestinian population, who need to be subjugated to keep this Jewish majority. So it's called demographic engineering, which basically is a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. And I think Pape says, not in this chapter, but elsewhere, that ethnic cleansing, so the Nakba, shouldn't be seen as a one-off event. It is a constant, it's a structure, it's a constant process. This demographic engineering is ongoing, because you've got to make sure you keep this majority, otherwise the state of Israel can't exist the way it is. So if you're Palestinian, not serving in the army is seen as a reason to discriminate against you. So Pape talks about initially Palestinians didn't mind joining, but as time went on, obviously things changed. And if you're not part of the army, your housing and employment is especially restricted. And 70% of all Israeli industry is said to be security sensitive. So 70% of all industry is closed to you if you're a Palestinian. So all this, you're an enemy from within. So all this does is serves to exclude and strangle Palestinians from within Israeli society and outside of Israel. And it's just part of that logic of elimination that Patrick Wolf talks of, a colonial logic, which underscores Zionism. Just another thing I find really strange about, just my own thought about the IDF, is that it's essentially a civilian army. So if everyone has to pass through it, how that colours, the kind of society, the culture, the politics, and that constant interaction that Palestinians will always have with their oppressors. Okay, next slide. Right. Okay. So Pape talks about how the land is budgeted, and so Palestinian councils receive far less funding than the Jewish counterparts. 90% of the land is owned by the Jewish National Fund, and that's only available for purchase for Jewish citizens. So immediately, 90% of the land is cut off from you if you're Palestinian. So that results in accelerated Jewish settlement building, and then the shrinking and de-development of Palestinian settlements. So Pape makes an example. There's a Palestinian population in Nazareth, which has tripled in size, but hasn't expanded out of its boundaries 1 square kilometre, whilst the Upper Nazareth Jewish settlement has tripled in size. So you get this real, view of this kind of strangulation, that there's just no space for growth, for prosperity. You're just kept held. Whereas the Jewish settlement can grow and prosper, has green spaces. I think I read somewhere that, Palestinians apparently don't need green space, they don't value it, and this all creates an abnormal socio-economic reality. So the most affluent Palestinian village of Mi'elia is still poorer than the poorest Jewish development town in the Negev, and Palestinians are excluded from living in these settlements. And Pape makes an interesting point where he says, can you imagine if Jews or Catholics or, were not permitted to live in certain towns or villages in the UK? And just quickly, just 2 other points. Jewish settlers receive 4 times more water than the Palestinians do, and the Palestinian aquifer, so that's the land, the water within the land, is depleted and then redirected to Jewish settlements. And also the JNF, I remember seeing a clip with Kamala Harris saying something about, talking romantically about these JNF tins coming around and putting money in them to plant, forests in Israel. And those forests basically whitewash the destruction of Palestinian villages. So it's just erasing that Palestinian landscape, replacing it with European trees that are not, that don't suit the climate. Yeah, I found that quite sad. Okay, so crime of apartheid is the intention to maintain domination of one group over another. and it's the intent to dominate has been regularly asserted by Israeli leaders. I'll just go to 11. Okay, so is that house demolitions? So house demolitions are not a new concept. They were introduced during the British Mandate period when 2,000 homes were demolished. And just from the infographic, if you can just see, like 25,000 homes result in 160,000 homeless people. And just that the sheer number of people who, just have to start again, and what happens, it's to devastate communities. And Pappé says there's an erasure of a focus of life and existence, as well as a policy of displacement and dispossession. So there was, basically, I was just talking mainly about how the system of the apartheid is about fragmentation and separating the Palestinians from groups from one another. So to make sure, so Gaza is cut off from the West Bank, and villages within the West Bank are cut off from each other, and even within individual villages are bisected. You've got the Apartheid Road, which runs through 80% of the West Bank. And then how there's just different groups of Palestinians subject to different laws. So I think there's about 4 different groups. So those within Gaza and the West Bank are subject to military law. You've got the 48 Palestinians within Israel who have kind of procedural democratic rights, but they're still subject to different, there's about 50 different laws encoded within Israeli law against them that discriminate against them. But the Pappé says that in East Jerusalem, West Bank and Gaza is so ruthless, and that's where Israel behaves as a dictatorship of the worst kind. So I had a slide that showed all the different leaders just quite openly stating their intent to dominate, saying things like, we need to Judaize the Galilee, Judaize the Galilee, and the Jerusalem plan, which aims to have a demographic ratio of 40-60, and these policies can only be done through this kind of ethnic cleansing. So your citizenship can be revoked at any time if you're a Jerusalemite Palestinian, to maintain this ratio. And then you have kind of systematic oppression. So Jewish children, so a Palestinian child would be tried in a military court, whereas a Palestinian child would be tried a Jewish child would be tried in a civilian court. And then Pappé also talks about the settlers who are allowed to form vigilante groups to harass people and destroy property, and they work in collusion with the IDF. And tactics have ranged from terror attacks, daily harassment, uprooting of trees, destroying yields, and millions of Palestinian income is lost through destroying these yields, shooting randomly at homes and vehicles. So Palestinians are given 2 options. They either accept their incarceration in a mass prison, or they resist and be targeted as soldiers and units like a conventional army. So there should be a discussion about how Israel uses the word terrorist, because it allows Israel to not act consistent in line with international humanitarian law by treating civilians as targets when they actually have the right to resist, an illegal occupier. So whole villages and towns are bombed as if they were military bases, and we're seeing that exact same thing now in Gaza. And just lastly, I'll quickly finish because I've done really badly with time. But the features of the enlightened occupation, I think they say that Palestinians within Israel they live in much better conditions. But there was I had a quote from an Arab Israeli member of the Knesset who said it's a farce. They don't have they might be able to vote, but all they can vote is for their own oppression. All the policies are all the same. He can still lose his land. He can still have all these things happen against to him. So it's not a democracy in any sense of the word. And just to kind of start erasing these colonial narratives of a benevolent occupier, that you can't have such a thing, and this whole idea that Israel says that it's a democracy, but I think everyone's kind of accepting the language of apartheid now and occupation, and hopefully the ICJ will help cement that.
Your presentation was brilliant, absolutely great. You've summarized the chapter really beautifully. I just wanted to add to resources about this chapter. When Ilan Pappé discusses the Palestinian population of Israel, which means that these are the Palestinian citizens of Israel. They are the people who, when Israel in 1948 ethnically cleansed Palestine, they expelled about 750,000 people, and about 150,000 remained behind and were displaced internally. Eventually, the United Nations shamed Israel into giving them citizenship because Israel was looking very badly, very, very bad to the international community. So it sort of was forced to give them citizenship. So they allegedly became citizens, which means they can vote. And supposedly they would have had the same rights that somebody like me should have had. Susan Nathan, she was a friend, and I kind of lost touch with her over the years. But Susan Nathan was a British Jewish woman who made Aliyah to Israel. She thought, oh, well, I'll do what Jews are supposed to do. And then as soon as she got to Israel, she realized what was going on. So she moved to a village called Tamra which was a Palestinian village inside Israel. And she ended up writing this book called The Other Side of Israel, which I highly recommend as an incredibly important resource. This book, Susan did a wonderful job of researching exactly what's wrong with the way Israel treats the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And you can see plenty of evidence there. Ilan touches on that. Plenty of evidence there that they're in fact not and never have been equal citizens of the state. And the other thing I wanted to say is that the intention has always been in Israel, and everybody knows this, it's called all the land but without the people. So the fact that the Palestinians are there was just tolerating them temporarily until Israel can finish them off, which is basically what the Gaza thing is showing us now. Israel sold this fiction of democracy to the world, to the Western world, to appeal to the world, while it needed a lot of economic, military, and political support. So it's never really a democracy, never was a democracy. I don't know if any settler colonial country can actually be a democracy. I grew up in Israel. For me, I thought Israel was a democracy because I could vote and I was a free citizen. But democracy, like Israel, is more like a tyranny of the majority. A real democracy is measured by how it treats its minorities, and Ilan does mention that. So I just wanted to mention one thing is the organization B'Tselem. You mentioned, Sue, in your presentation how militarized Israeli society is, and it's a state of the military, some people say. B'Tselem in Hebrew means in the image of, which alludes to the Bible, or the biblical idea of humans created in the image of God. B'Tselem, people probably have heard a lot about it by now. It's been very active, but B'Tselem's original intent was actually to demilitarize Israeli society. That was the real intention in the beginning. Everybody, unsilence yourself and say goodbye. And it's so lovely to have everyone. And see you again. And I hope you found this meeting okay. Thank you so much.